They planned the next layoff in secret, funded it off the books, and sent the draft through a relay to Vicky/Annie. They erased my name from the system, except the one part that mattered. It began not with a bang, but with a blinking light. Subnet G17, buried in the back end of an archive vault no one had touched in over a year, flickered to life on a routine backup cycle. It was an old protocol, one Miles had designed himself, back when the company still believed in redundancy and risk tolerance. Every 72 hours, the system would attempt to push encrypted copies of flagged communications to offsite storage. But every 3 hours, a smaller, forgotten function would mirror unencrypted previews, just in case the encryption handshake failed. No one ever noticed it. No one ever turned it off, especially after they laid him off, because when they marched him out, they wiped the visible accesses, internal messaging, VPN credentials, active dashboards. But legacy cache privileges, those were buried 3 layers down, behind admin tags that hadn't been reviewed since the server migration. Oversight through arrogance. And on that dull, rainy Tuesday, the arrogance paid its price. Miles sat at his kitchen counter, same place he'd sat every morning since the layoff. There was a calm stillness to that space now. No rush, no expectations, just the hum of the Lenovo ThinkPad he kept for quiet work, the same one that used to sync with his sandbox environment. The device chimed. Restored items 3 EM. He sipped black coffee, tapped the notification, and saw the subject line that changed everything. Stage 2 Fund Segregation Off-Ledger Draft. Sent 2:42 a.m. From Brett Harmon, Chief Financial Officer, to Philip Langley, Allen Rowe Advisory. A name Miles hadn't seen in 4 years, but had never forgotten. Philip Langley was the strategist behind one of the ugliest consulting scandals Atlanta's mid-market sector had witnessed. Disguised as optimization plans, his firm orchestrated quiet collapses of internal teams, funneled resources into shadow entities, and bought the assets back at liquidation value through third-party shells. It was all technically legal, but the lives lost under those restructures weren't numbers. Miles remembered sorting through their audit trail during a brief consulting gig back in 2021. He'd raised concerns, got stonewalled. And now Langley was back, only this time inside his former company. Miles opened the email. It wasn't obfuscated. No encryption, no clearance watermark, just raw text, and one instruction. If we're aligned on the Q3 culling, we'll need the discretionary channel cleared by July. Off-ledger pools from the last RIF wave should still be viable. Send draft paths by EOD. Don't use internal routes. Then a single line beneath. This message is privileged and confidential. Do not forward. No signature, no pleasantries, just the sound of 2 men tightening a noose. He didn't react, didn't flinch, just saved the file to his local folder named Requiem, then opened the headers. The SMTP trail confirmed it had passed through a private relay server, one that Miles recognized from a past infrastructure diagram, used only for senior leadership. No audit logs touched it anymore. Except the one ghost protocol he himself had written 3 years ago, Echo Catch. It was designed to trap invisible traffic. Miles had programmed it to flag late-night internal messages, sent via private tunnels that didn't match employee scheduling patterns. The idea had been dismissed by leadership. Too paranoid, too resource-intensive. So he left it buried, quiet, dormant, forgotten. Until now. You built the whole empire on silence, he murmured, voice quiet, almost reverent, but forgot one echo, because the email wasn't just incriminating, it was a skeleton key. A timestamp. A provable link between the CFO and an external entity with a history of manipulation. And the phrase, off-ledger pools, wasn't financial slang. It was policy violation. If even a fraction of company funds were moved outside the books to stage a Q3 downsizing, they were not only in breach of internal code, they were looking down the barrel of an SEC investigation. He didn't need revenge. What he needed was precision. And this email, this was the scalpel. He paused only once to pull up an old compliance directive from the parent company in Chicago, Article 6.1, subsection 4. Undisclosed external financial manipulation involving leadership and third-party consultancies is subject to automatic compliance escalation if flagged by an internal audit node. Audit node. Echo Catch was an audit node, decommissioned in name but never in function, and the backup it captured, It wasn't just luck. It was protocol, designed by the very man they underestimated. Miles leaned back. He didn't smile, just stared at the code, then opened a second secure drive labeled Anchor Points. Within it were snapshots, metadata logs, timestamp charts, a breadcrumb trail leading back months. He'd started building it the night they fired him over Zoom. Not out of spite, out of habit, because patterns always reveal themselves. You just have to wait long enough for the silence to speak. And now, it had. They thought they had erased him from the system, but data doesn't lie. Systems remember. And the one thing Brett Harmon forgot to encrypt was the one thing Miles had been waiting for. It wasn't just the email. That would have been enough for most people, a single thread to pull. But Miles wasn't most people. He didn't trust surface-level wins, not when Brett Harmon was the kind of man who spoke in coded language even in private. No, if an off-ledger fund was being staged for a Q3 restructuring, there had to be more than just vague phrases and late-night whispers. He went back to the payload, checked the contents of the restored files again, 2 others. One was a log trace he already knew, but the third was a PDF blandly titled Client Projection 3 PPF. It sounded like a forecast report, typical consultant material, except the size didn't match the name. A projection file should be light, charts, data points, maybe some slide graphics. This one was 23 MB, and there was no metadata, no author name, no timestamp inside the PDF itself, just one sheet, plain, neutral font. Miles opened it. The header said, Advisory Positioning Phase 2 Target Modeling. His fingers stilled. The language wasn't accidental. He'd seen versions of this before, documents designed to sit in the gray area between strategy and plausible deniability, but this one wasn't abstract. It was surgical. Page 1 contained a table. Departments, headcounts, projected savings, average severance payout, and a final column labeled Redeployment Viability. But it wasn't theoretical. The entries were real, names blurred, but Miles could still see employee IDs, exact formats used in their internal HRIS system. He ran a quick regs check on one, confirmed, valid, active profile still inside the company. This wasn't a model, it was a target list. He flipped to page 2. Another table. Asset flow if under 90-day window. Subcomments for vendor absorption, internal resource liquidation, and consultant contingency. It was coded speak for cutting people, stripping assets, and repositioning them under consulting banners to avoid optics. He closed his eyes, just for a second. This wasn't a plan, it was a scalpel already halfway through the flesh. These weren't numbers, they were people he'd worked with. Engineers, data analysts, even back-end support. He remembered one ID belonged to Helen Tsao, who used to bring muffins every other Friday to the DevOps floor. They'd flagged her as non-essential with low redeployment viability. Miles opened the document properties again. Still nothing. But the file structure told a different story. Deep inside the encoding was an invisible layer standard with PDFs created using Langley's firm's proprietary export tool. And buried in that layer, a line that read, exported from PL/row model engine v3.1 unregistered build. That was it. That was the thread. Unregistered build, which meant it wasn't pushed through official Allen Rowe channels. It was generated locally, likely from Langley's own machine or an unsanctioned device, which meant it could be tied directly to him without the firm's protection. Miles took a screenshot, not of the document itself, but of the internal byte string that contained the export tag. Then cross-referenced it against a sample library of Rowe's engine signatures he'd archived back in 2021 during the Atlanta project. It matched exactly, which meant this document, in its unencrypted, unwatermarked form, was as close to a fingerprint as Miles would get. Not proof of intent, proof of action. And even better, the version control system had been lazy. Whoever exported it forgot to flatten the hidden layer, meaning the original track changes, comments were still embedded in the XML spine. Miles used a lightweight parser. And then it hit. There were 6 comments total. 5 short, but 1 long. A paragraph written by Langley himself. In the margin of the first table. It read, "Make sure HR doesn't get direct access to this draft. We'll need to frame this as preliminary until after fund clearance." Brett said legal should stay out of it until we anchor language. That one comment was enough to trigger automatic escalation under Internal Compliance Rule 8.2. Miles had helped draft that clause. It was created after a whistleblower lawsuit nearly cost the company $9,600,000 0 cents. Any internal memo or planning doc suggesting intentional avoidance of legal review was, by policy, a mandatory compliance violation, whether actioned or not. And the fact that this file had reached his deprecated drive meant it was sitting somewhere in Brett's cache, likely forgotten after a late-night sync, never expecting to be touched again. He encrypted a copy of the file with the clean SHA-256 signature, archived it, then opened a secondary archive, one only 5 people in the entire company ever knew existed. Inside that folder, prior consulting case summaries, hashed data trails from Atlanta, and a flagged alert that read, Langley/Rowe pattern match greater than 75%. It was a pattern Miles had tracked, mapped, and stored, never for revenge, only for readiness, because patterns don't lie, and consultants don't change, they just shift masks. He closed the file, uploaded the metadata trace to an air-gapped flash drive, and tucked it in the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, right beneath the manila folder labeled System Residue. He didn't need to leak anything, not yet, just needed to wait. Because now the system was whispering, and the whispers weren't kind. Philip Langley. The name didn't just ring a bell, it rang a whole cathedral. Miles had written it once in red ink on a legal pad during a layover at O'Hare 3 years earlier. Back then, Langley wasn't just a name on an email. He was a shadow behind a dozen workforce streamlining strategies that looked legitimate on paper, but hollowed companies from the inside. He used strategy as a scalpel, cutting departments clean, hiding liabilities behind vendor contracts, then reabsorbing talent under new umbrellas to strip severance obligations. The technique had a name in the forensic accounting world: internal liquidation. Legal enough to pass, unethical enough to ruin people. The first time Miles saw Langley's signature was on a proposal submitted to Benford Medical Group, where Miles had been brought in to audit their post-merger tech integration. The deck looked clean. Too clean. Something about the numbers didn't sit right. The ratios between employee classifications, the timing of resource realignment, and the way funds moved across cost centers. Miles did what he always did. Quietly, he scraped metadata, tagged invoice IDs, tracked vendor flow, and one night in a Marriott hotel just outside Atlanta, he realized Langley's model was designed not to optimize, but to collapse. He flagged it to a senior VP. "We're not auditors," they told him. "We're implementers. Don't overstep." So he backed off, at least outwardly. But he kept a copy of that model, saved its digital fingerprint, and added Langley's name to a private watch list folder called Architects to Remember. Not out of spite, out of preparation. Because Miles didn't forget. And now, as he stared at the email thread between Brett Harmon and Philip Langley, time spoke 2:42 a.m., everything locked into place. The off-ledger fund, the exported PDF, the modeling language he'd only ever seen once before. This wasn't just financial manipulation. This was a recycled scheme. Cut, paste, disguise. Miles reopened the PDF from earlier, this time not as a document, but as a data object. He extracted the XML structure embedded beneath the surface layer, the spine of the document most people never saw. There it was. Same engine tag, same formula structures, same logic path used in the Benford file. Even the version history ID matched. Langley hadn't even rewritten the engine. He'd reused the exact same export logic. A11 code twin. Miles paused. Opened his archive drive, pulled up the Benford file. Overlaid the formula structures, matched every single macro tag. It wasn't similar, it was identical. Column G in both documents. Projected resource cost delta. Cell formatting, identical. Comment threads, same phrasing. In one cell, both documents read, apply only if redeployability index less than 0.35. He blinked. That phrase wasn't even real finance language. It was Langley's proprietary term, fabricated during a 2020 white paper Miles had dissected out of curiosity, and now it had resurfaced in his former company, buried inside a document that was never supposed to be seen. He leaned back, not in shock, but in grim recognition. Langley hadn't evolved, he'd just moved. Changed logos, updated slides, recycled playbooks. And Brett Harmon, he either didn't care or didn't know. Either way, he was using a man with a proven track record of ethical erosion and giving him full access to Riverton's structural underbelly. Miles opened his old notes from 2021, internal memos, draft warnings, never sent. There, in a folder labeled Roe Langley Observations, sat an unsent summary. Multiple indicators suggest Alan Roe Advisory is recycling models used in prior liquidation projects to facilitate cost shifting under strategic realignment. Recommend formal legal audit prior to future engagement. Drafted, reviewed, then ignored. Why? Because no one wanted to be the obstacle. They wanted to be the solution. Slick ones with graphs and ROI promises and shallow victory metrics. But Miles had always looked past the surface. He reran his internal pattern tracker, a tool he'd quietly maintained post-termination just to satisfy his own sense of order. The tracker blinked red. Pattern match, 94%. Langley/Roe advisory pattern detected, recurrence flagged. That was all he needed. The name wasn't just a memory, it was a pattern of behavior, duplicated across 3 clients, now including Riverton. He clicked Export Log. Save the chain of pattern matches, including timestamps, document hashes, and match confidence percentages. Then created a new folder called Recurrence Evidence, Category A. Not because he planned to send it. Not yet. But because someday someone would ask, when did we know? And Miles would have an answer. With time, date, and signature. He opened one last note, scrawled digitally in the margin of a compliance draft he never got to finish before they fired him. It read, Langley's real product isn't cost savings, it's plausible deniability. He stared at that sentence, then copied it, pasted it into his encrypted archive, and beneath it typed one more line. Not anymore. He didn't press send, didn't call anyone, just closed the lid of his ThinkPad. Because Langley had re-entered the building, but this time Miles wasn't watching from inside. He was watching from the outside, with nothing left to protect except the truth. Most people think truth comes in a single revelation, a flash, a headline, a gotcha. Miles knew better. Truth didn't arrive like thunder. It built like pressure, quietly, in background threads, through patterns no one wanted to acknowledge until they became undeniable. That's how he approached the timeline. One breadcrumb at a time, no shortcuts, no assumptions. The email from Brett to Langley wasn't the beginning, it was the midpoint, the kind of thing that only surfaces once enough tracks have already been covered, which meant if they were preparing stage 2, then stage 1 had already been completed. Miles went hunting for it, not inside messages, but inside metadata. He started with the raw headers from the 242 AEM email, traced the IP handoff, the subnet bounce, the lack of internal logging. That wasn't accidental. They were using the quiet channel, an unofficial handoff pipeline through a legacy relay node that was never retired because Brett insisted it be kept open for vendor efficiency. Miles had pushed for its removal twice. Both times denied, now he knew why. It left no trace in the centralized dashboard. But the physical server still logged pings for handshake validation, and that handshake log, buried inside the Layer 3 router of the North Annex, still synced with the old diagnostic console, which meant every transmission timestamp was still sitting there, untouched, in a raw .dat format. Miles parsed the log, found entries for 5 prior midnight transmissions in the last 2 months, all sent to the same masked outbound port, Langley's endpoint. Same file sizes, same pattern, but unlike the last one, none of them triggered the backup protocol, until this one. Why? Because all the others used the new export tool Langley had switched to after a firmware update, a cleaner model, with encryption baked into the pipeline. But the last file had failed its export, crashed halfway, defaulted to the deprecated engine, and got logged unencrypted. That was their mistake. Not a misstep. A technical glitch. Miles cross-referenced the dates of those transmissions with internal calendar metadata. Matched them against days where IT had flagged irregular traffic but brushed it off as spam. Every time, the same pattern. A consultant login on a virtual machine Brett had authority to provision but had never logged as official usage. VM221 Beta. Miles remembered that tag. It was originally created for a contractor's sandbox 2 years ago during a cloud migration project. It was supposed to be decommissioned, but Brett had kept it alive, just in case. Now, it had become the transmission engine. Miles downloaded every syslog fragment associated with that machine. Piece by piece, he reassembled the transmission times, the document fingerprints, and the target nodes. A timeline emerged, not vague, not interpretive, a data-stamped trail that looked less like a mistake and more like a rollout. March 3rd, 12:58, AEMM. Initial ping from VM221 beta to Allen Row endpoint. March 7th, 2:11 a.m. IEM's first file. Transfer size 6.1 MB. Encrypted. March 14th, 2:49. IEM second file transfer size 11.4 MB. No return ping. March 28th, 3:06. IEM. Transfer logged followed by packet bleed into diagnostic subnet. Error flagged ignored. April 10th, 2:42. IEM. Final file, crash on encryption, reverted to legacy protocol. Captured by EchoCatch. Miles didn't just see dates, he saw orchestration. At least 5 data packets, spread out, staggered, low visibility, coordinated during off hours. He layered this against internal org chart revisions, ones announced without fanfare. Between March and April, 6 managers were quietly reassigned, 2 departments reclassified, 3 team leaders retired early. All positions matched exactly with the cost modeling columns from Langley's PDF. One of them, a senior systems analyst named Jared Keel, was listed as non-essential, limited recovery potential. Jared had built the authentication protocol for Miles's old department. He was also the last person Miles had coffee with before the layoff. Miles remembered Jared saying something about the way their restructuring feels hollow. Jared had been gone a week later. Official reason, performance redundancy. There was no such thing, not in that context. That was a phrase Langley's team had used back at Benford. Miles had flagged it as a linguistic anomaly. Now it was appearing again in Riverton's HR memos. He clipped every instance, compiled the internal language structures, ran semantic diffing, found 86% similarity between current HR terminology and Langley's 2021 restructuring script. They hadn't just copied the structure, they'd recycled the vocabulary. And that was gold. Because vocabulary in the compliance world can be fingerprinted just like code, especially when it's proprietary to a vendor. Miles compiled it all into a timeline deck, not flashy, just cold, surgical. Title slide, Untracked Restructuring Q1, Q2 Advisory Activity. Subtitle, Unauthorized Consulting Activity Involving Legacy Relay Nodes. No commentary, just data. Just structure. He encrypted it, saved it with 3 different hashes, then copied it to a drive marked Chain Integrity V1. Still, he didn't send it. Not yet. Because a timeline, no matter how perfect, doesn't shout. It waits, just like he does. Because when truth is built brick by brick, you don't throw it at them, you build a wall, and wait for them to run straight into it. There was no drama in the way he packed the drive. No triumphant music, no sharp breath of revelation. Just a cold, quiet click. As Miles slid the encrypted USB into its case, labeled it with nothing more than a date, May 12, 803 ME, and stood. His movements were deliberate, weightless, as if the gravity of what he was carrying had already passed through him and settled somewhere deeper. He didn't rehearse what he would say, he had no speech prepared, because truth, when built properly, speaks for itself. It doesn't need volume, it needs placement, and he knew exactly where to place it. The Legal Affairs Division was housed 3 floors up in a wing he used to pass by every Thursday for cross-departmental syncs. Back then, no one paid attention to who walked those halls. Now, as an ex-employee, even with no badge, he knew exactly how to navigate it. The building's guest check-in system hadn't updated their contractor whitelist in months, and his name still sat under Legacy Systems Consultant, Internal Workflow Audits, a label no one ever questioned. He gave the receptionist a nod. Here to drop something off for review. No meeting needed. She smiled, pressed a button, and the security latch clicked open, just like it always had. As he walked the hallway, fluorescent lights humming above, Miles felt nothing. No satisfaction, no dread, just calibration. Every step was part of a system he once built, now turned back toward the truth it was always designed to serve. He reached the door. Legal Affairs Compliance Division. Knocked once, didn't wait. The man inside was typing, blanched up. Paul Mercer, Assistant Chief Counsel for Internal Controls, a man with a memory as sharp as his reputation. He frowned, puzzled. Miles? Miles gave a single nod, no handshake, no greeting, just stepped forward, placed the small black drive on Paul's desk like a signed affidavit. Echo catch triggered, 5 files, 1 attachment with metadata trail. Langley's name came up. You'll know what to do. Paul didn't move for a second, then sat back slowly, eyes narrowing. Langley? As in Alan Rowe? Miles said nothing, just locked eyes for one breath, then turned toward the door. No elaboration, no request, just movement. Because this wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about system behavior, about the architecture of silence being fed back into the very institution that let it fester. He had built the node that caught the unencrypted file. He had left the compliance flag active after being told to disable it. He had stored the pattern signatures even after being let go. And now, every piece of that system had done exactly what it was designed to do. Paul didn't call after him, just stared at the drive, because men like Paul understood weight, and that black piece of plastic was heavier than most court filings. Miles reached the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. A woman walked past him holding a box of case files. She didn't recognize him. No one did anymore. But that was the point. They had erased his name from dashboards, wiped his credentials, reassigned his badge ID, but they hadn't removed his fingerprints from the system. And systems, unlike people, don't hold grudges. They hold structure. The elevator doors slid open. He stepped in alone. No music. Just silence, deep and precise. As the floor numbers blinked past, he didn't look up. He didn't replay what just happened, because it wasn't an event. It was an inevitability. He had placed the truth where it belonged, not shouted, not leaked, just delivered. And the rest? The rest would unfold like gravity. Behind him, Paul Mercer would insert the drive, review the logs, match the hashes, cross-record the vendor name, see the phrase off-ledger pooling, see the unauthorized VM. The end. See Langley's export engine. See the signature Miles had embedded in the audit trail. The one clause only one man in the company had ever written. If system detects external financial manipulation involving known flagged vendors, trigger escalation under Article 6.1. Drafted by M. Conway. It wasn't just a protocol, it was a quiet voice, saying, I saw this coming, and I built the net before they ever jumped. The elevator reached the ground floor, doors opened. Miles stepped into the morning sun. No applause, no fireworks, just air. Clean, crisp, unburdened, because some battles aren't fought in rooms, they're won the moment you leave one, without needing to look back. Silence has a weight. In corporate environments, it rarely means nothing is happening. More often, it means too much is. 3 days passed. Not a word. No announcements, no emails, no ripple across the company's Slack. But something had shifted. Miles didn't need to be in the building to feel it. It started with small things. The public-facing compliance dashboard, which hadn't been updated in over a month, suddenly showed a change. Internal process review. In progress. No details, just a status. Then came the calendar freezes. Several mid-tier managers were seen canceling meetings without rescheduling. The Monday town hall, Brett had planned to announce Phase 2, postponed due to strategic realignment. Strategic realignment. That phrase again, the same one Miles had seen used to explain away the quiet reassignment of Jared Keel, the demotion of 2 procurement leads, and the disappearance of an entire data compliance pod in March. This time, it wasn't in a file. It was in people's voices, quieter, less certain, because no one knew who was safe anymore, not after no one knew who, had dropped something into legal that made the air heavier on the 4th floor. Brett Harmon wasn't seen in the cafeteria. His executive assistant stopped posting morning summaries, and Paul Mercer, the compliance attorney Miles had handed the drive to, was spotted walking into the CEO's office without an appointment, twice. That didn't happen unless the walls had started to close in. But what caught Miles's attention wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't. He monitored public-facing site edits, tiny tweaks to wording on investor briefings. Phrases like operational continuity began surfacing in boilerplate language. That was investor speak for, we may have a problem, but we're pretending we don't. Then came the login audit. Someone inside had triggered a full credential sweep. Miles knew because his former Sandbox credentials, disabled since his termination, were pinged for revalidation. That could only mean someone was crawling backwards through system access, looking for anomalies. They would find nothing. Because he hadn't left fingerprints, just echoes, and echoes don't break rules, they illuminate them. One morning, he received a message from someone he hadn't heard from in 9 months. Olivia Mendez, former ethics coordinator turned internal liaison. Her message was brief. You were right about Langley. Quiet storm coming. Stay invisible. That was all. No greeting, no signature, just warning in a whisper. It confirmed what Miles already suspected. Langley's name had surfaced in a way that couldn't be buried this time. The advisory contract Brett had funneled through procurement's special projects tag was being peeled back, line by line, vendor by vendor. He imagined Paul Mercer with a printout of the PDF, staring at the phrase off ledger, knowing exactly what it meant in the context of SEC scrutiny. But what made Miles pause wasn't that legal had the file. It was that no one knew where it came from. There was no note, no return address, just a signature hash that pointed to EchoCatch, an old protocol not on the current IT org chart, meaning no one could tie it to him, meaning Brett couldn't defend against it without admitting he knew about it. That was the genius of the system. It didn't attack, it revealed. Quietly, without bias, without face. So Brett couldn't point fingers. All he could do was wait. Wonder, and that wondering began to show. 2 of Brett's direct reports submitted unexpected PTO requests. Another VP declined to attend a regional conference. And the latest financial summary, usually polished and prepped for board alignment, was late. Not by accident, by fear. Because in the vacuum of silence, even the confident forget how to breathe. Miles received another message, this time anonymous, a single screenshot, the subject line of a forwarded email. Urgent, discovery of unauthorized consulting protocol. The sender, Paul Mercer. The recipient is the CEO. There was no context. No body text, just a reply from the CEO that read, handle immediately, do not escalate until we've reviewed full exposure. That phrase told Miles everything. It meant the upper floor wasn't preparing a defense. They were preparing to contain fallout. But the beautiful thing about structure is, once a single part collapses, it reveals every load-bearing lie beneath it. Miles closed his laptop, made no calls. He didn't text back. He didn't need updates. He didn't want credit. The system was speaking now, and the people who once thought him obsolete were suddenly listening to something they didn't even know bore his name. Not a report, not a file, but a quiet, self-correcting force he'd left behind, not to attack them, just to outlive them. It was almost funny how the latest revelation came from the file no one had looked at closely. Everyone's attention had gone to the big one, the PDF with modeling terms, the email with incriminating phrasing, the metadata trail that pointed to Langley. But that wasn't what broke them. It was the Excel sheet, titled blandly, support_personnel_rev2vgx. Just another attachment tucked beneath a thread between Brett Harmon and someone from facilities coordination. Legal had flagged it as low priority until someone, maybe Paul Mercer himself, opened it out of curiosity. Miles knew because 2 days later, that very same file name appeared in a new system alert pushed from the internal compliance repository, flagged, HR Data Sensitivity Breach, Level 2. That didn't happen unless personal data was exposed, which meant someone had found the sheet's hidden layer. Miles remembered that file. It had come through in the same packet as the final PDF Langley sent, the one that crashed encryption and triggered EchoCatch. At the time, it seemed auxiliary logistics, maybe facility mapping, but Miles had checked everything, and the moment he saw that Excel sheet, he knew it didn't belong to facilities. Not with those columns. Not with that sheet depth. It had 4 tabs, only one was visible. The rest were hidden, but not encrypted, just marked invisible by default Excel formatting. Rookie mistake. Or maybe just arrogance. Miles unhid them all the day he retrieved the backup. First tab, Disposition Matrix Q2, columns A through G. Department, full name, employee ID, current role, years of service, performance tier, and then column G. Action path. He stared at it for a long time. Action path. Most were labeled with dry corporate jargon. Transition candidate, outsourced viable, non-recoverable. And then, a few, just a few, were tagged with something colder. RIF suppress notification. Miles ran a count. There were 23 of them. Suppress notification wasn't just a phrase. It was code. An internal workaround used to bypass automatic HR alerts when processing batch layoffs. Technically, it wasn't illegal, but it was deeply unethical. The only time it was used in the past was during a corporate merger where optics were sensitive, when the company didn't want risk of news spreading before their PR department could control the message. And now it was being applied to employees who'd served over 10 years. Names Miles recognized. One of them? Eleanor Park. Lead QA analyst, worked weekends without being asked. Once flew back from vacation early to fix a deployment bug Miles himself had flagged. Her action path? Non-recoverable/RIF suppress notification. Another? Devlin Torres, network engineer. The guy who stayed behind during the storm blackout to reboot the cooling system manually. Same tag. Miles didn't need revenge. But this? This was a list. A pre-written erasure plan. And legal hadn't even known it existed until now. That was the twist. The big PDF was theory. This Excel sheet was action, execution. Miles could imagine the look on Paul Mercer's face when he reached that fourth tab, the one titled Buffer Justification, Board Language. It was a script, literally. Pre-written phrasing for executives to use when explaining the operational pivot to the board, complete with sentence starters like, in light of macroeconomic pressures, and after careful workforce reassessment. It was PR dressed as policy, spin written in advance, as if people were just components being swapped out. But the mistake, the one that cracked it wide open, was tab 3. Sync Map Langley Timeline. It listed every consultation meeting Brett had held with Langley over the last 90 days. Dates, durations, follow-up tasks, and in the final column, file names, including the one Miles had already intercepted. Client Projection 3 PPL. That connected the dots. It proved that Brett wasn't just passively receiving Langley's analysis, he was integrating it, building operational directives from it, acting on it. And once you prove that link, policy kicks in. External advisories influencing HR operations without board knowledge constituted governance breach, which meant this wasn't just a scandal, it was a reportable offense. And the best part? That Excel file had never been touched, never renamed, never stripped of internal user history, which meant the document owner was traceable. Brett Harmon, last saved by barman at rivertoncorp.com. Timestamped, locked, irrefutable. Miles didn't smile, just pressed save. Again. Added a second tag to the file, human layer confirmed, because this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about proof of disregard. A list of names, reduced to metadata, until someone bothered to look deeper. And Miles had. Always had. That's why he still had the file, why the system had held it, not for leverage, for memory. Because systems forget nothing, even when the people running them try their best to. They never announced it as an emergency. No alarms, no flashing inbox pings, no formal memo cascading through the company tree, but the air told a different story. Something had changed. Quietly, permanently. On the 17th floor, the level no one entered without clearance and calendar invites, someone placed a card in the center of the boardroom table. No name, no sender, no paper trail. Just 6 words, printed in serif font on soft gray stock. Did Miles Conway see this coming? No one claimed it. But no one moved it either. At 9:00 a.m., the quarterly review meeting commenced. The board filed in, 10 chairs, 9 occupied. The 10th, at the end of the table, remained empty. That seat belonged to Brett Harmon, and Brett Harmon was no longer answering emails. Paul Mercer, the assistant chief counsel who'd gone quiet after the initial file drop, sat halfway down the table. He said nothing, but his laptop was open, and beside it, a flash drive. Black, labeled only Echo Catch. That wasn't part of the original agenda, but neither was the card. The board members read it in turn. Some chuckled nervously, as if it were a joke. Others stared longer than they needed to. One man, Director Hayes, a 28-year veteran of post-crisis corporate cleanups, spoke first. So, did he? Silence followed. Then Mercer cleared his throat. I can't speak for what Miles saw, but I can confirm he left behind a system that predicted the exact vendor, behavior, and timeline that led us here. A pause, then he added, he didn't report it. He didn't escalate it. He just prepared for when the system would eventually catch what people ignored. That word, ignored, hung in the air like a verdict. One of the newer board members, a tech startup founder still in her 30s, frowned. Are we saying this was planned? Mercer shook his head. Not sabotage, just structure. Silent structure. The CEO, Richard Lane, leaned forward. What do we know for sure? Mercer clicked. The screen behind him lit up. A heat map of internal transmissions Brett had authorized. Red nodes for unauthorized access, yellow for proximity violations. He looked like a network bleeding from the inside. 5 undocumented engagements with Langley's firm. 3 financial models copied from prior flagged incidents. 1 personnel matrix using suppressed notification codes, triggered internally by a compliance ghost rule that should have been removed 2 years ago. Ghost rule? Another board member asked. Mercer nodded. Echo Catch. Protocol written by Miles Conway, designed to detect patterns of concealment in file behavior, specifically from repeat vendors. It was deprecated, but never deleted. The room fell still. Then Director Hayes asked the question everyone else was circling. So, the thing that caught all this was written by the guy we laid off. Mercer gave a single nod. That's correct. Another pause, longer this time, a kind of collective audit, invisible but heavy. They had cut a man who built the very system now saving their necks from regulatory collapse. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. One woman, older, quiet until now, picked up the card, turned it in her fingers like something ceremonial. Why now? She asked softly. Why is this question being asked now? Mercer didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the screen, loaded one last image, a snippet of the file registry log. 4 words. Last modified by M. McConway. Underneath, a timestamp dated 4 months before Miles' termination, meaning he had predicted this not after being pushed out, but while still serving the company. He'd seen it coming. Maybe not the full collapse, not every actor, but the shape of it, and instead of fighting it, instead of arguing or warning or calling for a spotlight, he just lit a fuse in the foundation, programmed to burn quietly until it reached something flammable. And now, it had. The boardroom grew heavier. Legal liability was now certain, but what stunned them wasn't just the exposure, it was the elegance of how it unfolded. There was no whistleblower, no angry blog post, no headline scandal, just structure, a system that spoke after everyone stopped listening. And the man who'd built it? Silent. Gone. Untouched by the fire he'd designed the sprinklers for. The CEO finally closed his notebook. I want everything re-reviewed. All advisory contracts, all compliance protocols, start from Conway's archives. He didn't say the word rehire. No one did. That wasn't the point. This wasn't about bringing Miles back. It was about reckoning with what he'd left behind, a system more ethical than the men who ran it. As the meeting adjourned, the card was left behind. No one pocketed it. No one threw it away. It just sat there. 6 words on Greystock, a whisper in a room built to ignore whispers. Miles never needed to hear the answer. He never needed to be called. Because the truth he left behind had finally spoken loud enough for them all. And it hadn't asked for applause. It had asked, did you listen when it was quiet? Not every truth needs an audience. Not every consequence needs a microphone. Some things, when they land exactly where they're meant to, don't echo, they settle. Quietly. Completely. That's what Miles understood better than anyone else in that building. He never wanted to make noise. He just didn't want the silence to be empty. And so he filled it. Not with confrontation, not with fury, but with quiet design. With audit logic no one bothered to delete. With offside flags embedded in dead servers. With conditional triggers that waited not for permission but for patterns. And when the patterns finally came, they unfolded exactly as he knew they would. not because he hoped they would, but because the numbers were always going to align. That's the thing most people never realize about the trail. It doesn't start with malice. It starts with efficiency, with words like optimization and streamlining and discretionary channels. It hides behind PowerPoints and polished phrasing, and the ones who initiate it never see themselves as villains, just decision makers, just survivors. Until one misplaced email, one uncaught export, one backup system designed by someone they thought was already gone, remembers what they were hoping everyone had forgotten. You see, Miles didn't build EchoCatch to trap people. He built it to catch silence, the kind of engineered stillness that follows unethical decisions dressed in compliance language. He didn't do it because he was bitter. He did it because he believed in architecture that outlives human loyalty. He believed systems should remember the difference between what's right and what's permitted. Most of us, when wronged, crave justice loud enough to be recognized. We want the apology, the reversal, the confrontation. But there's another kind of justice, one that doesn't demand recognition. It waits, it documents, it places small truths in the right places and lets time sharpen them into consequence. That's what Miles did. He wasn't chasing revenge. He was building memory. And when that memory finally triggered, it didn't explode. It whispered. In audit meetings, in unexplained resignations, in boardroom questions left hanging in the air. A system doesn't yell when it works. It simply refuses to hide the truth. And the people who once dismissed you, the ones who rolled their eyes when you flagged a discrepancy, who said you were too detailed, too cautious, too old school, suddenly realized that caution wasn't overthinking, it was armor. Miles never walked back into the company. He didn't need to. His fingerprints never left, not because he forced them to stay, but because he'd built them into the very bones of the place, not as revenge, as insurance. So what's the lesson? It's this. Not every war is fought in real time. Some are won in the setup, in the quiet hours when no one's watching, in the comments you leave in a code base that might never be read until one day someone needs to read it, in the silent protocol that activates only when something goes wrong, in the habit of doing things the right way even after the room stops caring, especially after. It's not dramatic, it won't trend, but it's real. And when it lands, it doesn't come with applause, it comes with stillness, with the slow turning of heads, with the sentence no one wants to say but can't ignore anymore. He saw this coming. That's not just vindication. That's legacy. And Miles didn't need anyone to say thank you. The system already had. It remembered him. Louder than any memo ever could. And now, it would remember the people who didn't. If this story hit something deep in you, something real, take a second to hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment if you've ever been erased quietly, or if you've ever left behind a system that knew what to do long after you were gone. And if you're watching from the shadows like Miles, just know we see you, and you're not alone. And while it feels like this chapter just sealed itself shut, trust me, this is only the silence before the next signal. Because Chapter 8 doesn't open with a file or a meeting, it opens with a voicemail, left at 2:13 a.m. EM, from a name Miles hasn't heard in 17 years, a name that doesn't belong in the story they thought was closed. But sometimes, systems remember more than you programmed them to, especially when someone else starts whispering back. Chapter 8 begins soon. Stay tuned. It doesn't get quieter from here.